Everybody joining me first on the show today. We are previewing the Georgia-Ohio State, the Peach Bowl matchup of the semifinal. I think the best matchup of the two semifinals, in my opinion. The two brand names there were Georgia and Ohio State. And joining me to preview the Georgia side of it is Palmer Thombs. You can check him out over at DawgsHQ, where he is the team beat writer, part of the On3 Sports Network. And Palmer, we hadn't talked in a while, but I appreciate you coming on and I'm previewing the playoff.
Absolutely. Always an exciting time of year, bowl season, and an extra special, exciting time if you are a fan of a team that's in the playoffs. Like you said, I think that these are throughout the majority of the season, these were the number one and number two teams in the country. Two teams that I came into the season thinking had a shot to win it all. Really two of three teams, these two plus Alabama. And so to see them clashing in the semifinals, I think we're in for a treat.
Yeah, I kind of went into the season with the same thought, which I went into the season, I'll admit. I had Alabama as my preseason national championship pick.
As did I.
So as everything coming back, and I felt, okay, Georgia's still going to be really good. I mean, they're not going – they're what they've got going, recruiting and the players, they're going to replace what they lost on defense, especially. So, and then Ohio State, my big question was who's going to be the fourth team, because I didn't think Michigan could do it again with what they lost defensively. And nobody saw TCU in this. I think my other pick to get in the play, I think I had Utah as a team getting in.
Yep, I had Utah. I had Alabama as the one playing 4 Utah and Ohio State as the 2 playing 3 Georgia. So got my semifinal matchup right, not necessarily the rankings of it, and certainly not the 4 teams.
Well, here's one I got really bad. I had picked Oklahoma to get in there. So that was not my best look on that one. I had
you win some, you lose some.
Yeah, I was right. I'm not Clemson getting there. So why don't you get Clemson getting there? Because I don't trust DJ. That quarterback, but that kind of happened with this matchup. Of course, there's been, especially after the selections was made, that we knew who the 4 teams were about this draw. And really, you look at Georgia as the number 1 seed, the number 1 team in the country for most of the season. They've got the tougher draw, though. It looks like Michigan at the number 2 got the TCU is not going to be an easy matchup. TCU is a really good team. I do not want to disrespect them, but when you look at what 1 and 2 got, Georgia got the tougher end of it.
No, absolutely. And I mean, I'll go on the record saying I think the winner of this game, regardless of if it's Georgia or Ohio State, is going to win the national championship. If it's Georgia, I like the way that they match up against both those teams. We saw Georgia, Michigan last year. I think we've seen Georgia play a TCU type team, over the course of the years. Just from a talent standpoint, Georgia is way more talented than both those teams. And if it's Ohio State, which I think it absolutely could be, again, I think that they are, from a talent standpoint, better than both those teams, especially TCU. Obviously, you've seen Ohio State and Michigan play every year. The last 2 have gone the way of the Wolverines, but I just can't see 3 in a row and 2 in one season. Those rivalries tend to shake out, shake out pretty evenly. So, certainly would be interesting to see those 2 teams squaring off. And so the way that I look at it, the winner of this Peach Bowl is probably going to be hoisting the trophy in LA.
Yeah, with Ohio State, Michigan, I'll say this about this, and I'll watch that game when they played, the last week of regular season. That game was still a 1-score game going to the 4th quarter.
Right.
Some turnovers by C.J. Stroud, and then they could not stop Michigan's run game, which Michigan up front did, beat them at the line of scrimmage on both sides once again. But that game was closer than that 45-23 score. I think a lot of people just look at the score, they look at the rushing stats from Michigan and said, oh, Michigan just dominated. That was not the same game as last year. Michigan just dominated from start to finish. They were the better team that last season. But I think that's a misconception about Ohio State coming into this game because, like I said, that game was close going to the 4th quarter to Michigan pulled away.
Right, and that's been part of my prep for this playoff game, has been going back and watching that Ohio State-Michigan game, because I think, I think Georgia and Michigan like to play similar styles of football, physical football with skilled players on the outside capable of making plays within that physical identity. Two teams that have built their brand on that. So that was part of my process to prep for this playoff game. And Certainly agree. I mean, you look at that game, like you said, it was a close game into the fourth quarter, and then Donovan Edwards breaks off 2 long touchdown runs, and all of a sudden you see a big separation on the scoreboard. Ohio State has to press a little bit, go for it in situations where you probably wouldn't be if it's a closer game. So you're absolutely right there that game, the separation between those two teams certainly, much less than the score indicates. And the way that I look at this Ohio State team coming in is they are very similar to what Georgia was last year, coming off of a loss in the SEC championship game to Alabama. The score probably not as indicative there, of the separation between those two teams. We saw how a rematch played out in Indy later in the season, and we saw how close that game was for a little while. One bad quarter ends up turning this game into a blowout with Alabama coming out on top. But those two teams were very equally matched up in terms of, talent. And I think that's the same way for Ohio State. And so it's certainly going to be interesting to see how, Georgia last season took that as motivation going into the playoffs. They had a chip on their shoulder. Is Ohio State going to have that same chip on their shoulder? Are they going to have that same motivation to get a rematch with the, team that they lost to? Certainly going to be interesting, but obviously, like we've said several times already, Peach Bowl is a big one before.
Yeah, absolutely. It's going to be fun, and it's the last game before we ring in the new year on the 31st when they do play in prime time. So let's just look at the game. I want to start with Ohio State offense versus Georgia defense, strength versus strength. That's the strengths of both teams, which they both, especially Georgia, they're solid on offense too. So we'll get to that. So coming out of the SEC championship game, you saw a Georgia defense give up a lot of passing yards to LSU. And some people, and this is just the way I saw it, and let me get your take if you disagree with me. A lot of people looked at it like, well, Georgia was up big, so LSU put a lot of yards. Early in that game, Jaden Daniels was able to find some stuff. Now, he was not able to use his feet, which is one part of his game that really helps. But he was able to – they were moving the ball with some success through the air. So coming into this matchup, when you look at the Ohio State offense versus Georgia defense, for you, is there any concern? Because you look at Ohio State, obviously got C.J. Stroud, who was a Heisman finalist. He was a runner-up last season. Didn't have the numbers this year, but he's got 2 1,000-yard receivers in Marvin Harrison Jr. and Emeka Egbuka out there outside. I mean, are they the new Alabama with receivers? I mean, they lose guys and they replace them at Ohio State. But from that standpoint, from what happened against LSU, with the pass defense, are there any concerns on that end for you for Georgia going into this matchup?
I mean, absolutely. You'd be crazy to not be, at least a little bit concerned. That is going to be the emphasis of this Georgia prep, in my opinion. And it's funny you bring up that game. That was, again, part of my playoff prep process. And I actually just got done doing that, had a little bit of downtime today ahead of National Signing Day, and so watched that game, rewatched that game, rewatched Ohio State, Michigan, the Tennessee Georgia game, and Ohio State Maryland. Those 4 games have been the ones that I've focused in on, 2 for each team. And you're absolutely right. It wasn't just because Georgia was up big on LSU. Malik Neighbors and Kayshon Boutte were able to find space. And really that's the way that I would describe that passing game. They found space. It wasn't like they were, just blowing by Georgia's defensive backs. They found space in the middle of the field. And so to me, there's a lot of pressure in this game as you go and you face 2,000-yard receivers in Marvin Harrison and Emeka Egbuka. You've got to limit the amount of space that is there for the taking. Julian Fleming is another incredibly talented wide receiver. It absolutely helps Georgia that Jackson Smith-Njigba is not going to play, because he's probably the most talented receiver in all of college football coming into this year. Was obviously limited with injuries in 2022, but we saw what he was capable of as he rung in the new year last year in that Rose Bowl matchup against Utah. I think that if you're Georgia, the pressure is on that secondary. The pressure is on a guy like Keely Ringo to step up and perform. a guy like Kamari Lassiter, who really the pressure has been on all year for him as he's been opposite of, the potential first-round pick. His first year as a starter for Lassiter, he's had to, really just carry a lot of weight for that defense because teams will throw it his way more so than they do Ringo's. Chris Smith, an incredibly talented player in the secondary at safety. Javon Bullard, a guy at star who is, a physical player, both in terms of his pass defense, his ability to blitz, and Malachi Starks, a young guy. You talk about this secondary. You've got a very experienced guy in Chris Smith, and you've got a guy who's in his second season as a starter in Keely Ringo, and then you've got three guys that are in their first season starting. Being Javon Bullard, Malachi Starks, a true freshman, and Kamari Lassiter. The pressure's on all of them, but I think that as you go and you look at Georgia's season, when the pressure has been on, they've really performed. That game against Tennessee, the pressure was absolutely on, and that's why it was part of my playoff prep process. Wanted to go back and take it in again, how Georgia responded to playing a team that had wide receivers like that. Tennessee certainly did. And so Georgia stepped up, rose to the occasion. Those defensive backs certainly did. And I'm very interested to see how they do it again here. That to me is the matchup that you're watching in this game. And, how does Georgia create some pressure up front to help them out? Are they going to be able to do it with four, Jalen Carter and company up at the line of scrimmage, or are they going to have to bring some extra assistance and put even more pressure on the DBs? So to me, that the Georgia pass defense and Georgia pass rush against Ohio State's passing game, that's what's going to decide the matchup when the Buckeyes have the ball.
Yeah, I'm glad you mentioned the Tennessee game. I had that in my notes, and I had Jalen Carter just circled here because just what he did in that game. And look, Hendon Hooker is a quarterback that can run, but he actually is a quarterback that prefers to stay in the pocket and throw the ball. And that's more so with C.J. Stroud. He's even less of a running threat. And I've seen some times with him when he has to actually get out of the pocket, he's not as successful rolling out in those situations. He's a pocket guy. He won't stay in the pocket. So maybe repeat what you just said, but that's got to be a big key there. What Georgia does up front, because Ohio State, they've heard it, what Michigan did to them up front. Look, no disrespect to Michigan. We'll talk about them next week here on the show. But I think Georgia's a lot more talented up front than Michigan. So that whole thing with Ohio State and Jalen Carter, this guy, I think, could be the MVP of this game.
Absolutely. If he has a game like he did against Tennessee, he was the National Defensive Player of the Week that week because he forced 2 fumbles, had 2 sacks. The guy was all over the place. Just an absolute force to be reckoned with. You've seen that in the second half of the season as he's really, wasn't healthy for the first half. Was playing through an ankle injury that he suffered literally on the first play of the game against Oregon. Had a more severe knee injury that sidelined him for 2 weeks. And since he's come back, he's been a force to be reckoned with, the key to Georgia's defense. And so if the pressure is going to be on those DBs, how do you help him out? Well, getting to the quarterback and not letting him get rid of the ball, that's certainly one great way to do it.
Yeah, absolutely. So that's what I'm looking at. That's the guy I'm looking at for this game. Just what he does and just getting, because it's one thing when you get pressure, from the defensive ends, the pass rushers, but when you can push the pocket up, with what he can do and make quarterbacks uncomfortable in the middle of it, I think that's always they're both effective, but when you can do that up the middle, that's a whole nother thing because it just changes everything for a quarterback.
100%.
When you look at the Georgia offense versus the Ohio State defense, now I will say this: I think Georgia's offense doesn't get enough credit for what they are. They are a top 7th in the country in total offense. And Stetson Bennett, and I kind of got bothered, Palmer, when we went into the Heisman and Stetson Bennett was mentioned, because I was looking at of the 4 quarterbacks, he's second in passing yards. He's got more passing yards than C.J. Stroud. He's got more passing yards than Max Duggan. I think people just look at the touchdowns, and that's what it's about. He only has 20. The other guys have a lot of touchdowns. But this year with Stetson Bennett, he just seems like he has obviously taken his game to another level. And the offense is more pass-oriented. Yes, they lean on the run. Run game is what Georgia wants to do first, but they pass the ball more this year ended last year. But watching this team all year, what's been the biggest difference in the growth and the development that Stetson been at?
Well, I'll go back to that Heisman conversation because it's actually, I was in New York. It was something that we looked up while we were there. Like you said, he threw for 20 touchdowns, and that's not some earth-shattering number. But he also added 7 rushing scores. And so to me, you've got to consider 27 total touchdowns to the other guys. Still less, and deservedly finished 4th. I mean, deserved to be there, did not deserve to win it. His career accomplishments are what they are. And, that deserves to be celebrated. But he also deserved to be in New York this season. But along those lines, we looked up and figured out within the 5-yard line, a Georgia receiver has been tackled within that 5-yard line. I believe it was 13 times. 3 of those turned into Stetson rushing touchdowns later in the drive, but majority of them turned into handing it off to the running backs and those guys punching in and from 1, 2, 3 yards out. So you turn a couple of those 13 into receiving scores and passing scores for Stetson. I think he's got a much better case to win it. And people probably aren't, there isn't such a huge gripe about him being there. As it pertains to his development, he's just been confident. I mean, you look at the guys that are around him, it's guys that he worked with all offseason, all last season, and it really has gotten, he's been able to grow. He's comfortable in this offensive system. The coaches are comfortable with him. It was a lot of the same things that we were saying going into the year, but we've seen it play out on the field. And coming off of his best performance maybe of his career, in the SEC championship game against LSU, threw for 4 touchdowns there. He had 2 great showings in the playoffs last year. The one game that he probably, of the 2 that he didn't look as good, the national championship, well, he looked good when it mattered in the 4th quarter and threw 2 very important touchdowns there. So with Stetson, I think, and this Georgia offense as a whole, you have to look at all the pieces. It's not just him. They're not asking him to, they're asking him more to be a game manager than they are a playmaker. He's certainly capable of making plays and will take matters into his own hands occasionally, but he also knows what weapons he has around him. He's got a great run game and an offensive line that has kept him on his feet. An offensive line that has paved the way for, several 200-yard rushing games. And so, if they're going to, if Todd Monken and company are going to ask him to hand it off 20, 30 times, he's going to hand it off that many times. If they're going to ask him to throw it 40 times, he's comfortable doing that too. Because he's got wide receivers, got tight ends, guys that are capable of making plays. Obviously, the health of Ladd McConkey going into this game is a big storyline. I do think he's going to play. The health and return of AD Mitchell is a big storyline. Stetson said it himself. He and AD have got to get comfortable again. We saw AD out there in the SEC championship game. He's only played in 4 games this year. Played in the opener, played very well in the opener against Oregon, and then got hurt on the first game of the Samford game. So that's game 2 for him. Game 3 that he played was against Auburn, and he played 4 snaps. So they've got to get him comfortable. Did not catch a pass in the SEC championship game. Did record a stat with a completion wide receiver pass there for the 2-point conversion to give Georgia 50 points on the day. But Stetson and AD have got to get comfortable again. And good news for them is they've got plenty of time to do it. So as you look at this, the matchup of the Georgia defense and that Georgia offense and Ohio State defense, I see big names in that, strong front 7. Jack Sawyer and JT, I'm not even going to try to pronounce his last name, Tui Moaloa or something. You've got big names up in the front. Tommy Eichenberg is a guy that has been there for a while. You've got experience in that front 7, but as you look on the back end, you just don't see the big names. I mean, as I think Ohio State became known for a little while as, maybe not DBU, but they had a pretty great reputation with first rounders like Eli Apple, Malik Hooker, Marshawn Lattimore, Denzel Ward, Jeff Okudah. you're not seeing that same kind of hype around those guys in the recent seasons. And so, to me, I do think that Georgia's offense is going to have to put up points. They're going to have to capitalize on their opportunities. And I think that they're fully capable of doing it. And also, I think that Georgia's defense is capable of getting some stops. To me, this game is very similar to that Tennessee game where you've got strength on strength when Georgia's defense and Ohio State's offense are on the field. You've got perceived weakness on weakness when Georgia's offense and Ohio State's defense are on the field. But I think the margin between Georgia's offense and Ohio State's defense is probably wider in favor of Georgia than any margin that there might be between Ohio State's offense and Georgia's defense. And so as a whole, you give Georgia the advantage in this game.
Yeah, and you look at in Ohio State, like I said, they've got good players. And if you look at their numbers, like they're one of the best teams in the Big Ten and get to the quarterback. And their numbers are good when you look at other Big Ten teams, but they give up a lot of big plays. Even against Michigan, they gave a 69 yards, 75-yard play, another 75-yard play, an 85-yard play. And you look at what Georgia's offense is, and Georgia's kind of a different offense than what you're used to seeing, the multiple tight ends, what they can do to 3 running backs. You talk about Ladd McConkey, and then they add him in the running game with Brock Bowers. I just feel like, and there's going to be a lot of opportunities for Georgia to make some really big plays because, and that's not just a Michigan thing. Ohio State has done that all year long. The one, I think, thing for them to look out for, they're good with turnovers. They cause 1.4 turnovers per game. I think there's been a couple times Georgia's got a little sloppy with it at the ball at times, but I think they'll be dialed in here. But that's kind of what, I'm seeing. Anything you could add on that?
Yeah, I mean, Georgia has gotten sloppy with it a couple of times, like you said. That if there has been one problem for this team on offense, it has been the turnovers. They fumbled it against LSU. I'm trying to remember if there were 1 or 2 turnovers in that game. Think they only had 1, but I could be wrong. But certainly, turnovers are things that can swing a game one way or another. They can make up, talk about that gap between Georgia's offense and Ohio State's defense. They can shrink a gap real quickly if you make mistakes or you make big plays if you're Ohio State. So you want to be on the right side of things, and you don't want to give teams, especially good teams, talented teams, you don't want to give them extra chances.
That's it. And like it's like in playoff games, any level, turnovers can, make you or break you. So, depending on where they happen to in the game. So finally, I told you, Twitty, we're probably going to hit about 25 minutes here on this conversation, but I'm not going to ask you to make a pick. I know you guys are going to do that, closer to the game, but just say Georgia wins this game. How did they do it?
They got to slow down those Ohio State wide receivers. I talked a lot about that, and I think rightfully so. That is what Ohio State is right now. They are wide receiver U. Like you said, they just constantly seem to be churning out incredible wide receivers, and they've got 2 more of them this year and several more down the line with the way that their recruiting has gone. So if you're Georgia, you've got to slow down those wide receivers. You've got to limit the big plays. You can't be getting beat deep. You can't be letting them find a ton of open space and run yards after the catch. You've got to, if they make catches, you got to be there to tackle them. And if you can be there to defend the pass and prevent a catch, that's great too. So I think the pressure is on Georgia, Georgia's defense against Ohio State's passing game, both in the secondary and their ability to get pressure up front. So if they win this game, if they're going to come out as winners of this game, they've got to decidedly win that matchup.
Yeah, it's going to be fun. It's going to be a fun game. Like I said at the top, best game of the 2 semifinals, just, with the names, the stars, the big time players in this game. So it should be a lot of fun. And Palmer, as always, it's fun to have you on, talk all things Georgia football. If the listeners, viewers want to check you out online, where can they find you and all the work you're doing over at DawgsHQ?
Yeah, DawgsHQ.com in that On3 network. We've got an Ohio State site, Letterman Row. So, be sure to check us both out before the playoff games. And You know, it's certainly an exciting time to be a Georgia fan as the Bulldogs look to defend their national championship, become, you know, in a rarefied air with a second straight. So you can follow me at Palmer Thombs on social media and at DawgsHQ as Georgia looks to enter that rarefied air.
All right, everybody go check Palmer out. And once again, Palmer, appreciate the time, and I look forward to talking again sometime down the road.
Of course.
Hold up. Video's not over with yet. Not quite yet. If you enjoyed this video, please subscribe on YouTube, Phillip Jordan Show YouTube channel. Also, hit the bell for all the notifications. And if you leave a comment on the video, including this one or many other ones here on the channel, I'll read it on a future edition of the show. You can also check out the show over on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, wherever you get your audio content. Just hit the subscribe button over there or follow whichever one they're asking us to do now. Hey, and also rate the show. I would appreciate 5 stars. 4 stars, you were just a straight up hater. And look, if you don't like the show, I guess you can give it a 1 star as well. But leave a review. I read those on the show as well. Really would appreciate you guys doing that. Follow me on social media at PJordanSEC. Hey, and also, you can email me, sports.phillipjordan@gmail.com. Now you guys can go find another video to watch. Hopefully one here on the channel, or wherever you're going next. But please do that. Subscribe to the channel, hit the bell for notifications, leave a comment, and check out the audio podcast.